ethnic diversity. And you gave the example from Bosnia-Herzegovina, where the attempt at diversifying the bench has also come for criticism. So following Professor Durham's lead, I would ask you to also think about a context like India, where if you look at our judicial structure, even though there is no explicit policy of apportioning judicial office by ethnic diversity, the model of self-selection which works from our topmost court, which again is a product of judicial activism, is kind of subconsciously considering ethnic diversity. So in fact, empirical work over the last 3 decades is showing that since we move towards this model of judicial self-selection, and the current government doesn't like it, I mean, they are extracting their retribution for this assertion of self-selection. If you look at the empirical data over the last 3 decades, there's always a token accommodation of ethnic difference. So you'll always have a symbolic representation of a certain community in India, which otherwise would not be well represented in the professions or even in the legislature. So while we do have a very complex scheme of affirmative action in government jobs, in elected bodies, in the judicial offices we only have affirmative action in the lower courts, which are at the state level. But in the higher judiciary, which comes under this model of self-selection, we call it the collegium system, which is again a long debate, so I can explain that to you over the break. One of the unintended consequences of the collegium system is that there seems to be this informal accommodation of ethnic diversity happening. So even though our original constitution does not contemplate consociationalism in the judiciary, it seems to be happening in practice. And a lot of people are now saying that rather than linking legitimacy to the actual quality of decision making, sometimes just the representation of communities on the bench itself might actually be doing the trick. And unlike the American Supreme Court, we have a multi-bench structure, and judges keep retiring and there's no real consistency. So this is a far more complicated sort of framework which you might want to include as you expand your scholarship. Right.
Thank you, Ravi. Just taking forward from Siddharth, there is a class dimension. Say after 2010, when Chief Justice Balakrishnan retired, we have not got any judge from Dalit, and at the moment there is no Muslim judge either. And in the process, you know, we did not pick up some good people, we picked up bad people, and the regional representation was also given. But I am on a different thing. While the religion of a judge would not and should not disqualify him from passing an order, and therefore I am not with Personal Law Board in saying that how can Hindu judges interpret our scriptures, but there have been judges who immediately after their retirement did not join a political party but joined Vishwa Hindu Parishad. And that is worrisome. And one example I will pick, there was one judge, Flavia is also familiar with his judgment, to which I will make a quick reference. This was one Justice Tilhari, who was an advocate of Vishwa Hindu Parishad in the Babri Masjid dispute. When he was elevated in the same matter, he decided that the worship will continue at the disputed site where the mosque has been demolished. And after retirement, then he was made a judge of a tribunal to deal with minority educational institutions. And there he decided Muslims are not a minority, and there is no minority in India, and if at all there is a minority, Hindus are in minority in India. And about his judgment, I just want to make a reference. As a judge, the question was about sealing laws. So there was a husband and a wife, they had a divorce, so some property was registered in the name of the wife. Now this man said that there hasn't been no divorce, and since the property of husband and wife for some archaic land law, you know, will be treated as one unit, so that woman was deprived of the property. The effect of the decision was like this. So you know, study in India, you know, have been done about the judicial pattern and behavior, that how these judges who subsequently joined such radical organization, what kind of judgments they have been given. But on death penalty, our sister institution in Delhi last year did a research, and we found that minorities and Dalits and poor people are overrepresented on the death rows.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Ahmed, you have the
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I will deviate a bit from the judicial or the judiciary aspect of justice. But actually, since it is a topic on religion and justice, I like to, maybe it's just a comment, I'm not asked, maybe you can react to this comment, it's not a question. One of the biggest injustices in the history of mankind was committed because of religion, in the sense that a state of Israel was created on the basis of a covenant given to Moses in Bible, in book of Genesis, where it is said that God gave this covenant to Moses, that I shall give unto thee and thy seed after thee the entire land of Canaan, which is Palestine. So based on this, a nation was completely expropriated from the Palestinians, and even after the UN gave them 50% of that, and even the other 50% which was given to Palestine, that also has been largely occupied today. And this continues despite institutions as institutions such as the UN being present. So where is justice here? So should we not also stop injustices being committed in the name of religion? This is one of the biggest injustices in my opinion. This needs to be addressed. Even today, the consequences of the injustice is being felt. The entire West Asian region, or as they call Middle East in America, today is suffering because of this injustice committed in the name of religion. This particular verse in Genesis is kind of taken as a holy title deed for Israel to exist. Almost ex nihilo, a nation was created, a country was created. How do you address this injustice?
It takes time.
Please.
Thank you, Professor Winter. One question for Danish Sahab. It's very Platonic, the whole idea that there is justice if everything is in its place. Who's going to decide whether everything is in its place? That's what intrigues me, because it can be very status quoist. Everything is in its place. Professor Winter, just to give you, carrying on from these comments, in the 1990s, after the Babri Mosque fell, was destroyed rather, a whole debate broke out mainly from among Western anthropologists and scholars from religious studies, saying, what is this new party that has come up? There is no such religion as Hinduism, and that this is a product of colonialism in the early 19th century. Now it struck me that they were operating on the same principle as the colonialists were operating. They had a model of religion, and that model of religion was Judeo-Christianity and Islam. That a religion has to meet the following condition in order to be classified a religion. And this debate went on and on till at one point an anthropologist, Professor T.N. Madan, said, why don't you start thinking of religious traditions instead of religion? My point I'm trying to make is that religious belief is just not belief, it is a mode of cognition. So that is why in Pakistan they declared the Ahmadiyas and non-Muslim, and if I'm not mistaken, Shias are also non-Muslims. Because, not yet, but there's danger, because all my Shia friends tell me that they are under considerable threat. But Ahmadiyas, the headquarters of Ahmadiyas are interestingly in India. And why? Because their model of worship does not meet a certain criteria laid down. So it's not only a question of religious. I wish I could share in your confidence that, but forgive me if I say that this is a peculiarly European belief that the public and the private can be separated. In fact, postmodernity has critiqued this very separation. So that is why we are sharing our experiences with you. Private is not always private. It very often spills into the public domain.
I have one last intervention. I really must.
Sure, sir. Thank you. I'm Rahul and I teach at the Symbiosis Law School, Hyderabad. Speaking of Islamophobia, we've always been sort of critical, and we've blamed the West for its coverage of terrorism. Now, do you think it's how they are not paid sufficient attention to the cause of terrorism and how they've blamed Islam on the whole? Do you think it's appropriate for us to be blaming the West, given the fact that there have been alternative parallel voices there? Say, there are two examples that I'd like to cite. One is Edward Said, a Palestinian writer who has been steeped in Western traditions, but yet has been very critical of the Western coverage of Islam. And also second, and a more recent example would be Jürgen Todenhofer, a German journalist who has been the first journalist who has been officially permitted to cover the ISIS from within. And he has been just as critical of Western foreign policy that has led to the rise of ISIS as he has been critical of the ISIS itself.
Thank you.